Let us descend into what is the labyrinth of Wraith one more time to look at the last chapter in Book 1, The Shadow.
Partially by accident, partially by design, this video covering Chapter 6, The Shadow, will be more fragmented, more divided than the others. Perhaps this is an unconscious or a semi-conscious metaphor for the shadow itself, and perhaps it's my own discomfort with some of the directly negative things I'm going to have to say, and some of the overt praise that I'll also have to deliver, because the chapter deserves it. It deserves both the criticism and the praise I'm going to give it, and neither one fits exactly what I want to say. So it is what it is. And so this video is divided. So as we go into this chapter, the hardest part about the chapter itself, and I'm only going to refer to this here and then not again, at least until we get into the commentary on the game itself toward the end of the series. But more than any other chapter, and beyond even what the game itself is asking you to do, Chapter 6 is expecting a real leap of faith. There are parts of how this chapter expects you, the player, to behave that very few other games ever will, and that it's so easy to disrupt by just saying, no, I refuse, either in character or out of character. There are things that happen to psyches because of their shadows that can be incredible dramatic moments, but they might only be dramatic to a few people around the table. Others, that particular experience might lack power or lack a focus on what it is that they're interested in, and being asked repeatedly to allow the focus to come down on those particular characters in that particular instance can be too much to ask. Again and again, this chapter says that people have to reject the typical role-playing game response and instead focus on what makes sense if this world were real. It's asking you to be willing to step in character into a scene that means everything to your character, but might in this moment mean nothing to you. You're asked to accept a cosmology which is very alien from what many people will have ever considered, and is very alien from how it's presented in the games in the World of Darkness line that exist before it, and struggling to come to terms with it and see it as truth, as real, as something that matters and has a real effect on your character can be a challenge. It can be a lot to ask. This chapter has a tremendous row to hoe, as we might say. It has stormy seas to sail, and it asks an awful lot of you, the reader, to take it on faith and do what it's asking you to do, and experience what it's possible to experience from this in-character stance. And so again, we return to the idea of coherence and incoherence in design. This is asking everything of you to come at it from the point of view of in-character play, whereas many other parts of the text that we've gone through are assuming that you're going to play it from a more player-focused stance. And that's interesting, and that's challenging, and it makes the game harder than it needs to be. Yes, you can play it from, a point of view looking down on the action. Sure you can. And yes, you can play it from a purely mechanical point of view. Of course you can. But at a certain point, how far away from character can you allow yourself to get and still actually be playing what Wraith is all about? That is a huge question that only you and your particular circle of players can answer. Having the psyche, having the character of the Wraith be divided into psyche and shadow, having these two things be opposed, having the psyche be the thing that is hanging on, wanting to survive, to continue, to accomplish, to do, and having the shadow there to undermine and represent the interior force of Oblivion is an incredible concept for a role-playing game. It's not one that this chapter manages to capture in those terms very well. It becomes confused in and of itself about what the shadow actually is. Is it the force of Oblivion working inside the Wraith to eradicate, as is suggested in the setting chapter, or is it simply the splintered and mirrored aspect of the psyche, of the personality of the Wraith, divided into itself because of the separation between the land of the living and the land of the dead? Right. I suppose this leaves us with the opportunity to decide for ourselves, but it does make the game a little vaguer and a little harder to play. Why am I torn? And why are all Wraiths these dual personalities with these shifting and warring perspectives on each other? So, as we go through the rest of this video, as you hear the high praise and as you hear the distinct and direct criticism of specific things that happened, remember that most of all, what this chapter is really asking is for this huge commitment, this huge leap of faith into a type of play which may expose some parts of your inner workings or expose some aspect of things that would normally remain hidden. But you can put it out there on the table and explore it. Or at the very least, you can create characters that are more than the sum of their actions, that will have play directly focus on the very fabric of their being, the substance of their memory, the energy of their thoughts and hopes and dreams. Is that kind of outcome, it's worth taking a leap of faith, isn't it? We've now arrived at a very difficult chapter. Chapter 6, The Shadow. What makes it difficult is that of all the parts of Wraith that get misunderstood, this one comes pretty close to the top of the heap. And it's not just conceptual challenges, but logistical challenges which come up. Things like the player of the Wraith communicating with their shadow. Right? How is that going to be conducted? Because according to the lore of the game, no one else can hear the shadow's voice but the psyche, the Wraith character itself. Does this mean passing notes? Does this mean slowing the game down so that can become possible? Does this mean allowing electronic devices so that texting can occur and open players up to the temptation of getting messages from other sources and so on and so forth? And how are we actually going to play? Now, when Wraith was originally written in its first edition, a lot of that, the texting issues anyway, the personal digital devices, was a lot less present. But the core of this logistical challenge remains, and so to make a 20th anniversary edition, that process really needs to be addressed. While the first edition of Wraith dug in very, very deeply and very, very evocatively into the interplay between psyche and shadow, and was excellent at communicating the way to approach being the shadow, a lot of ink ended up being written anyway about what is a shadow, how should your shadow guide, what is this struggle like, how to conduct a harrowing. So in order to do a 20th anniversary edition, that's a real benchmark for elevating the game to a new place to make it easier to play. So let's take a look at Chapter 6 and see what we can find. Overall, I was pretty happy with Chapter 6, but there are some things in it that, well, they don't stand up to intense scrutiny. So let's go through page by page, as we have been, and see what we find. Okay, so the shadow starts out describing what the shadow is, which is good, because there are going to be some people who go right here. And then we have a lot of boxed text. We have a big one on page 222 called The Shadow Speaks. And it gives you that first insight into the difference between how the psyche tends to view the world, or how a psyche will tend to view the world, and how the shadow will. And we get into this large section called Drawing Lines in the Mind, and that's divided up into the subsections: shadow play, keeping it separate, getting started, finding the shadow's voice, what the shadow wants, picking the right shadow, how much to say, respecting limits, cooperation, blaming the shadow, and catharsis. And inside that there are text boxes or sidebars talking about, in order, the shadow speaks, as I mentioned, then listening to the shadow, and best dirty tricks for shadow guides. So as you can see, real attention has been paid to this logistical challenge that I was mentioning. And this is where my first caveat comes in, because the text itself, while organized pretty clearly on all the things that need to be considered before launching play, it's muddled, because it's switching back and forth between talking to the player who's going to be playing the shadow guide, talking to the storyteller who's going to be organizing the creation of shadows, and being involved in who's going to be whose shadow guide and this sort of thing. But it's also talking to the players about what the shadow is. So it's trying to accomplish a series of things which need to be kept separate. What is it as a game concept that you are going to play with as a player? What are the specific aspects of that which connect to the storyteller? And then, how do you get in character? These things need to be kept separate, and they're not. They're muddled together, and that's unfortunate. Now, if you have a lot of experience with Wraith, that won't really matter, because those things are already muddled in your head anyway. You've played the game before, and you've had good experiences with it and bad experiences with it, and so on and so forth. So this will be right up your alley, I think. I think it communicates very, very well to established Wraith players. And the first time I read through it, I was like, yeah, they really, really did a good job. And then when I went over with a careful eye, and again when I paid attention to how it's trying to speak to people who didn't play it or haven't looked at the game in 20 some odd years, well, it's all over the place. It's not too bad. It's certainly not as bad as Chapter 1. Okay, there are regular and consistent warnings about going too far, and this will be my example of what I mean about things being muddled. It's giving consistent examples about what not to do as the shadow guide. Like, pay attention to the player whose Wraith you are playing the shadow for. All right? Pay attention to them. Make sure that you're not going too far. What do they mean by going too far? Often it seems like what they're talking about is talking too much, being too dominant, especially during moments when you're receiving details about the scene or the situation. So in other words, distracting the player from the mechanics of play, right? If you can't pay attention to the description that's coming in or the dialogue that's coming in because the shadow guide is running off at the mouth, then this is a procedural problem of play, and this is something that you should be sensitive to and back off from. But it's written in such a way that it makes you think about the content of what you are saying. Both of those things are problems. Both of those things need to be spelled out clearly, right? That the shadow needs to be on point. There are specific types of shadow with specific types of interest and specific types of dark passions, and there are certain things that they're interested in. And so the session zero kind of situation of building the Wraith, having it approved by the storyteller so that all the wraiths fit together. And then the storyteller and the shadow guide building the shadow. These all have to be relevant, not to some kind of perverse play that those two want to get up to affect you, the player of the wraith, but instead a real interpretation of how the presence of self-aware oblivion inside the wraith is causing them to erode. And this is a concept which is spelled out clearly earlier in the setting, which unfortunately, as this example I'm working toward highlights, it vanishes, it almost disappears here. The idea, the headspace that we could be getting into is of this, oblivion-tainted persona, where the wraith, the psyche, is clinging on, trying to remain, wanting to still be attached to something. The other side, the part that's fueled by oblivion, the part that is oblivion, wants to let go. Right? And how do we portray that inner struggle well? That's what this chapter ultimately needed to be about. Like I said, for experienced players, it, I think, accomplishes this goal. For new players, how can I know? But I feel like it will be more work than it needed to be, and where a particular sense of how oblivion taints everything was necessary. We end up somehow splitting the shadows and their spectral counterparts when harrowings come along into isolation from oblivion instead of being the actual force of oblivion inside. So that's a shame. It's a little bit of a disappointment. Other procedural things is everybody has to read this. Everybody needs to be a shadow guide, and then they're laying out the best tricks and procedures for people to do, which is good. I mean, it keeps people from reinventing the wheel, but at the same time, it predisposes people to be on the lookout for that sort of thing. And instead of putting the focus on interacting on the content of what the shadow and the psyche are saying to each other, we end up looking for how am I being manipulated, which will be really useful for some groups and less useful for others. But that's a minor thing. There's a lot of very strong advice, which is good, about catharsis and about harrowings. And having it all in one place will ultimately be a benefit as people get more and more experience playing. This chapter will take on more and more utility instead of being something that gets abandoned, which I think is good. So we have excellent descriptions of all the shadow archetypes, and then we move into providing it with angst, and then we get into identifying its dark passions and its free points. All right, and in the free point section we have all the thorns, the special abilities that only the shadow has, and there's quite a few all here together, all in one place, which is again awesome. Then we have our example of shadow creation. It's quite short. And then we have our description of what angst really is and the mechanics for it. And honestly, I think this is in the wrong place. This needed to come earlier in the chapter, before the character creation stuff for the shadow. But then we return to catharsis and how that works. And then we get alternate rules, right? So for groups who are having trouble with the shadow, or they're having trouble with the conversation, or they're having trouble with procedure, here's some different ways to do it. And I think this is fantastic, hands down. This is really good. It's in the right place. It needs to be here, and it can certainly help you stage the game up from learning to get comfortable with the setting and the whole idea, and then slowly making shadow guiding more and more complicated so we get closer and closer to the rules as intended. So that's excellent. So we have, for the alternate rules, we have the dedicated shadow guide. This existed before. This is the one person who plays all the shadows, and they aren't the storyteller. So this is like the assistant storyteller that's present in the other games. Then we have storyteller shadows. It's pretty obvious from the text that the authors aren't very happy about this, and there are lots of, again, logistical challenges to it. keeping track of everything, including playing everyone's shadow, means that the shadows are going to fall by the wayside, or they're not going to be handled with as much adeptness as they need. But it's there as an option, especially for smaller groups. Then there's deterministic shadow guiding, where, as the group we sort through it and handle it mechanically. And then there's the no shadow. And the no shadow option is presented as the don't do this, because you're not playing Wraith if you do this, but if you absolutely have to do this, here's how you could do it. And it needs to be there. Although I agree with them that this really wouldn't be playing Wraith. This would be playing something like Ghost. Then there's a shadow example of play, which focuses on what the shadow guide does, and it even includes a please back off section pretty early on, right? Which is good. So this actually models what this chapter is talking about, which is rare, and I think it's well done. So good on them for that. There's some startlingly good art in here of a variety of different types. We then move into harrowings. So we're now on page 240, and we get deeply into harrowings. What actually happens? There's a sidebar on the directors of the action, which tells you about the specters. And there's another sidebar immediately afterward called Harrowing Logistics, a Guide. This is excellent. And then for the players, of course, there's what actually happens, getting out, modifying the odds, harrowing systems and targets. And we talk about the different types of harrowings there, the targeted harrowings, and destruction harrowings, and rewards. Then it just keeps going. It sails on into group harrowings, and then self-inflicted harrowings. Then the mechanics, the actual procedure of running a harrowing. This is talking directly to the players. Then role-playing inside a harrowing, the contested harrowing, where it's really not clear to the people at the table if the player of the Wraith succeeded in resolving the issue brought forth by the harrowing, and clearly lays out how to deal with it. Then there's an example of play of a harrowing. Then, as before, we have an alternate harrowing system in case you're having trouble and you still want to play. They give us an example of play of a failed harrowing to help you be able to be in the position to pull the trigger. And what a harrowing is a challenge to who the Wraith is, their actual makeup. They fall down into the labyrinth, the place where all the detritus of lost memory, lost dreams, lost hopes end up calcifying on its way, being sucked down into oblivion. Underneath the raging storm of the tempest, which is made up of who knows what, memory and passion and hope and dream, and there you have to come face to face with the dying of some aspect of yourself. That's why you're in this harrowing to begin with. You've taken too much damage. You can't conceive of yourself of being able to hold together. You've taken an emotional beating. You've become cold on what used to be a hot passion. You have lost a fetter, this sort of thing. This is Oblivion's work at erasing those things which are holding you together, and it's your rejection, your abject rejection of those things, but not the rejection of the harrowing itself, but the rejection of what it is that Oblivion wants you to see as true. You have to work through, resolve, and regain or retain your grip on that aspect of yourself. It's an incredibly powerful, incredibly cool part of Wraith. So being able to run it properly is essential. And that ends the chapter. So all in all, a problematic chapter, better for old players than new, but the more practice you get playing it, and the more of these alternate work your way into the game systems you try out, the more value it'll have. So good job. Until next time, we move into Book 2 and Chapter 7.